If you like our videos, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. And thanks again to all who have donated to us via our PayPal link.
Die Vorstellung von der Sprache als eines Instruments der Information drängt heute ins Äußerste. Sobald von tieferen Verhältnissen die Rede ist, tritt sogleich eine andere Sprache ein, die poetische.
Terrence Malick's films are often said to be influenced by Martin Heidegger's philosophy, which he studied and wrote about before he became a filmmaker. This video will try to determine in what way Malick's films can be considered Heideggerian. For Heidegger, the primordial meaning of technology is the capacity to disclose the possibilities things in the world afford us by engaging with them the same way a sculptor could do with a piece of marble. But in modernity, technology became the means by which human beings can control things in the world, which according to Heidegger is the end result of Western metaphysics. When we do metaphysics, we take whatever we experience to be independent of us in order to determine the order behind it, meaning how all the things in the world relate to one another, the identity of reality as a whole, and what is the unchanging law, identity, of any particular thing that causes us to experience it the way we do. But wanting to know the identity of a thing stems also from the desire to know how to act against it and use it. Any metaphysical pursuit, then, turns the world into a container with stuff to be known, controlled, and used, and, as a result, we and the things in it begin to lose their being, their meaning, since everything becomes lawful, transparent, rather than meaningful, opaque. Instead of asking what we and things in the world can manifest, we are busy systemizing reality to the point that we find ourselves lost in a meaningless world. But according to Heidegger, we can't withdraw from the world in order to know it as it is in the first place. We can't be free from existence by rationalizing the world, since we are always already in the world, and only by achieving more profound understandings about our situation in it can we make our being in the world more meaningful. By letting the light of being shine through, we can rediscover ourselves and our world. Malick adopts this anti-modern attitude and portrays lost characters in a cold world that is run by machines, as in his first two films, Badlands and Days of Heaven.
You didn't work, they'd ship you right out of there. They don't need you. They can always get somebody else.
In the modernist films of Michelangelo Antonioni, The Adventure and The Eclipse, the characters are lost because the foundation of their world has collapsed. The nothing is present in the architectural design, but it is also present in the faces of Antonioni's characters, since they realized that they can't live with confidence according to their humanistic values and desires. They are disappointed and sad. But in Malick's Badlands and Days of Heaven, the characters are angry about the emptiness modern society created, and they search for meaning in the landscapes they travel across out of nothing, the future, that is, out of being. In Being in Time, Heidegger focused on the meaning of being, that is, with the question of why there is something rather than nothing, which is basically asking, what is the possibility for anything to come into being, to show up for us? Human beings can answer this question because they are always already concerned with the question of being by merely existing, that is, because they are aware of their own being. In average everydayness, we understand the meaning of being, either as practical familiarity and involvement with entities, as being already with other human beings, or as being objectively present. We are directed by these understandings, and project ourselves toward the entities we face according to the possibilities they afford us in the situations we find ourselves in. This also means that we have a pre-reflective sense of self by merely being concerned with the use of our tools and by caring for others. And once we encounter some problems, irregularities, or some accidents happen, these become objects for us and we begin to reflect on their being and on our being in order to determine their identity. This means that the moment human beings become anxious, they tend to rationalize about their world and themselves in order to regain their control and restore harmony. The possibility of objectifying and theorizing about ourselves, others, and the world, that is, of doing metaphysics, then stems from understanding being as being objectively present. But according to Heidegger, this is an inauthentic understanding of being as that which forms what we experience, the real behind phenomena. Philosophers who understood being this way reduced it to God, the forms, innate ideas, reason, or universal history, to that which determines everything there is to be the way it is. But if we want to understand being authentically, we shouldn't try to determine its identity, to mathematize it, since by doing so, we lose all of its richness, that which made us wonder about it in the first place. Instead, we should answer how it is possible for anything to come into being, or, in other words, what makes it possible for us to have awareness of anything in the first place. By answering this question, we will understand better what being can manifest, that is, its meaning. We will be able to understand what being can afford us. Does it afford us to see the invisible, the identity behind things in the world? Or to see them in their meaningfulness, what they can manifest in the world? When we pay attention to our primordial experience of the world, we realize that we have awareness of our existence and the existence of entities in the world because of existential time, that is, because there are temporal gaps in our experience. And since existential time is open to the future, it doesn't have an identity which affords us to respond to the truth, to the meaning of any entity we face. This means that because existential time can always be more than what it is, different from what it is, it confronts us with the untruth, which motivates us to discover the truth. Existential time then opens us to the truth. It doesn't direct us to it, as when we posit a law, something that doesn't change but causes a change in the world. In order to rationalize any phenomenon in the world, we need to know its identity, the law that causes us to experience it the way we do, to see the invisible, the one that manifests the visible, the many. But we cannot rationalize our own being and the being of entities in the world, because our existence and their existence always already have meaning for us. Since we are aware of our being in the world, our existence can't be determined, and since we are always already engaged with them, we can't determine the identities of entities in our world. This means that we can't see ourselves and the things in the world from God's point of view. In existential time, the present doesn't move in a straight line because there is always a background and a foreground to our experience. Existential time, then, is not a continuous series of now points, as is metaphysical time, which we must use if we want to rationalize the world. This is because it is a determined motion in which the actual, the objective, can always be in the present, and as such it affords the observer access to the presence, the identity of things in the world. Only an unchanging law, the infinite, that which cannot die, can cause an effect to that which changes, that which exists and dies, and as such it has to govern itself through an abstract change, one that is independent of existence, of us and our experience of the world. Moreover, the past, present, and future, the three modalities that metaphysical time consists of, are not dependent on each other, but independent. Metaphysical time must be already complete, infinite, and as such, it cannot consist of incomplete parts that can perish, that do not have an identity. The past, present, and the future are independent now points that follow one another rather than cause a change to each other, which is the reason why metaphysical time will always preserve its identity, its objectivity. But since we are finite, that is, not independent, but dependent on and limited by the empirical world, there will always be a gap between our representations of the world and the way it really is, between us and being. The best we can do is to try to keep matching between the two, since at least we know that the truth, the identity of being, is already out there. But according to Heidegger and other philosophers, our representations cannot be separated from our world, since again we are involved in it. And even if they are separated, trying to match between them is self-defeating, since we will never be able to know if they are in fact identical. The truth is not outside of us, but we are in the truth, as Heidegger puts it. And as such, there is no need to be reminded about the incarnations of God's revelation on Mount Sinai in order to keep believing that the truth is already out there, or waiting for a rapture in order to have faith that, in the future, it will be revealed to us once again. We can't live according to an infinite, abstract notion of time, since things in our world present us with different meanings which afford us different possibilities we can project ourselves towards. And as such, the now cannot be represented and objectified in the first place. Existential time then is ecstatic. It is always other than itself. And as such, it consists of never-ending transitions towards ends, towards certain possibilities in the situations we find ourselves in. In existential time, the past is revived in the present when it meets a new possibility, that is, the future, over and over again. This means that the past, the origin, the formal law, cannot determine our existence now and forever, since we are always already open to the truth. Moreover, since beings and our being are not given to us, we can always understand the world and ourselves differently until we die. And any new understandings and self-understandings afford us to read the past differently, which, in response, gives us an uncanny sensation that things are and not what they are at the same time, that they are ambiguous. This can help us to ease our obsessions, since we understand that anything can have more meaning and curtail the violent tendencies we develop when we begin to lose a grip on our world. Moreover, it enriches our being in the world and makes us realize that we are free, that we have other choices.
I dishonored it all and didn't notice the glory. I'm a foolish man.
We acknowledge our ignorance and feel at home because things in the world have meaning for us once again, rather than being removed from us, meaning they are already known and unchanged. Heidegger's philosophy is circular rather than triangular. It doesn't need a center, a third concept that can come between us, the world, and others, since it constantly moves away from the center in circles. Western metaphysics, since Plato, tried to analyze existence, including human existence, by reducing it to something more real, unchangeable, independent, that has an identity, to explain phenomena in terms of the infinite, which is understood as the truth. Heidegger, on the other hand, following Husserl, argues in Being and Time that human existence cannot be reduced to anything. It is an end in itself rather than a means to an end. Moreover, being doesn't determine anything, but affords us to see a thing in its meaningfulness, that is, what it can manifest in our world. If we spend our time on Earth by living in the so-called actual world, the real world, and objectify everything around us, rather than trying to understand what anything we face can manifest, that is, try to understand the meaning, truth, of beings, we are going to lose our sense of being in the world, our sense of existing. The danger Heidegger saw in modern rationality, then, is nihilism and self-denial. Heidegger tried to show that by understanding the meaning of being as time, as potentiality, we will be afforded with the possibility of being authentic and realize ourselves each time we will project ourselves towards our possibilities. And if we would fill our being with new meanings, we will be afforded with new possibilities, and as such, redirect it. We understand the meaning of being as time primordially when we face our death, since the question of what is the meaning of being becomes more explicit and urgent for us. We feel as if we have to respond to it. By being towards death, we can understand primordially that existential time makes it possible for anything to come into being for us, since we see our own being comes into being from the future. We understand that there are more possible spaces we can curate until we die, meaning that we are always already oriented toward the possible rather than toward the actual. This is what the characters in Malick's film, The Thin Red Line, experienced. It is an anxious film since it is colored by death, the nothing, the untruth, by the possibility of impossibility, which makes the characters wonder about the truth of the war they are fighting in and the meaning of life.
Maybe all men got one big soul everybody's a part of. All faces of the same man.
Rather than glorifying it, the war in the film is portrayed as an absurd, stupid, horrifying, evil, and traumatic event, and nature is portrayed as cruel and indifferent to human values, a mere machine. In the jungles, we cannot look for a new world, a theme which Malick deals with in his film, The New World. The rational world of Captain Smith becomes questionable again, finite, when it meets the simple yet meaningful world of the Native Americans in the early 1600s. He becomes romantic and develops nostalgia for better times, before society corrupted the human soul and nature, a theme that keeps repeating in Malick's films, and he gets romantically involved with a beautiful Native American called Pocahontas.
Tell me, my love. Did you wish for me to come back and live with you again?
Their love affair opens both of their worlds to difference, to more possibility, which their laws and traditions try to repress. Eventually, this conflict between change and harmony causes a violent war between the two worlds. In this film, love is understood as openness, as receiving. It clashes with reason, with the given, as it is in many romantic works of art.
At the moment I was to die, she threw herself upon me.
Captain Smith is sent back to England, but Pocahontas thinks he is dead. Since she was disowned by her father, the chief, she can't go back to her tribe, and at some point she goes crazy out of loneliness and a broken heart. But eventually she marries a rich entrepreneur who owns a tobacco plantation, and he transforms her into an English lady. She travels to England with him, and at some point meets Captain Smith again. But now the two don't see each other in the same way they used to. They become ambivalent about the meaning of their love, and Pocahontas returns to her husband. Their European rational world had won at the end of this film. For Heidegger and Hegel, the acceptance of our finitude motivates us to question what is being and what we should live for, that is, who we are. But Hegel tried to show that each time we question the meaning of being, we actually attempt to close the gap between the finite and the infinite in order to determine its identity and our identity, that is, to reduce the finite to the infinite. For Hegel, then, we must be ambivalent about what we think is the truth, because it will always be incomplete, always on its way to being revealed. Heidegger, on the other hand, thought that when we question the meaning of being, we shouldn't attempt to objectify it, but discover what other possibilities it can afford us in order to rediscover ourselves and our world. When we try to solve problems, for example, the mind and body problem that philosophers obsessively deal with, we have to posit a law that can give us definite answers, and, as such, it requires us to step out of existential time. But questioning puts us back in existential time, into a dynamic space of meaning, in which objects that we took as given in the present all of a sudden have meaning for us. They have a potential to manifest something for us, which elucidates their truth. And the more they can tell us, the more meaningful and truthful they become. Philosophy, then, according to Heidegger, shouldn't give us answers, that is, to provide explanations to problems our metaphysical inclinations challenge us with, but to make our being in the world more meaningful. This is because, again, being cannot be objectified, identified, but that shouldn't discourage us. Being, in its totality, is concealed from us because we exist, but as long as we exist, we are open to it. If being was independent, that is, if it had an identity, our freedom to discover its meaning wouldn't have been possible. And this is what makes Malick's films Heideggerian. His camera and the characters in his films cannot stay still. They anxiously anticipate to discover something. The past in Malick's films is always sedimented in the present rather than leading the audience to the truth via narration, argumentation, and plot structure. Nor does it hold the truth, which is revealed to the audience through confessions and historical investigations. This means that in order to discover the truth, the characters in his films have to open themselves to others and the world once again. For example, The Tree of Life and To the Wonder don't follow a story but use camera movements, voiceovers, and flashbacks in order to open being once again and fill the lives of the characters with more meaning. These transitions also envelop the viewer's being, which is part of the allure of Malick's films. They try to help us to see the potentiality in everything we experience and live more concretely in our world rather than see it from above through formulas. And if these films try to reconnect us to our being in the world, his films The Knight of Cups and Song to Song disconnect us from it. In these films, different Hollywood stars show how superficial Western life is. When the viewer feels that the story is close to having a closure, something else opens up. But this openness is not very meaningful. The improvisations and open endings in these films don't open the future to new profound understandings, possibilities. And this was probably Malick's intention to begin with. That is, to show the audience that it is imprisoned in a repetitive, shallow present, which makes it harder to have a meaningful existence and open the future to difference. It is hard to rediscover the potential of our world since it is still governed by metaphysics, by the desire to know what things are rather than what they can tell us, that is, by the desire to objectify the present, which always leads to despair and nihilism.
Dear friend, I wonder where I was in all that time. A sleepwalker, in love with the world, in love with love.
world's a swamp. You have to fly over it. Fly.
The main character in his latest film, A Hidden Life, exercises civil disobedience to the new law in Austria in the early 1940s, which requires him to swear an oath to the German fascist leader. This is in contrast to Heidegger, who joined the National Socialist Party in 1933. The character's decision influenced his family's life, as the people in the village bullied them for it. We follow different attempts to convince him that evil is part of life, that God is dead, that the good and the bad are social constructs, that sometimes one has to be pragmatic and save his life before he can save his soul, and that his disobedience won't make any difference anyway.
They call me up a cancer. We're killing innocent people. Raiding other countries, preying on the weak. Now the priests call them heroes, even saints. The soldiers, the doers. It might be that the other ones are the heroes. Huh? The ones who defend their homes against the invaders.
Ever spoken with anyone else? Your wife?
No.
Family? Don't you think you ought to consider the consequences of your actions for them? You'd almost surely be shot.
Yes.
Your sacrifice would benefit no one.
But he just cannot do it, since he has a strong conscience. That is, he doesn't want to live in a world in which he complies with what he understands as evil. One of Malick's trademarks is his use of inner dialogues. For Heidegger, as opposed to Socrates, the self doesn't have to resolve its self-contradiction, to have a dialogue with itself in order to know itself, to reveal its true identity, but it has to have a dialogue with who it could become, its future self. The self is not primordially a thinking self, that is, two in one, as Hannah Arendt puts it in her book, The Promise of Politics, but always already a possibility to become one in the process of self-realization. Conscience doesn't come into being from the dissonance of the self with itself, but from the fleeing of the self from itself, which is the fleeing from responding to its being, that is, from asking again, what is the meaning of being, and who am I? For Heidegger, any dialogue with other human beings is possible because being is always being with others, and not because of the constant inner dialogue one is conducting in thinking. Moreover, being in a community for Heidegger amounts to sharing one's uniqueness as it is for Socrates and Arendt. But this uniqueness is not merely the unique point of view each one has on the world it shares with others, but its understanding of it. And by sharing new understandings with others, one can open this shared world to new possibilities. The main character in A Hidden Life says no to unjust human authority in the name of transcendent authority, the eternal, rather than the future. And this is perhaps the difficulty with Heidegger's philosophy. Heidegger thought that before prescribing how we should act, before we adopt rules of conduct, there is a need to investigate how ethics is possible in the first place. Meaning, how is it possible for Dasein, Heidegger's term for human being in time, to have ownership and authorship over its being? Is it through reflection and submission to the absolute? By being limited by the one, the infinite, that created it? No, because he didn't think that the metaphysical subject, the soul, exists. Believing that it exists is merely self-reduction that is meant to overcome existence, overcome actual life circumstances and self-denial. Instead, he tried to show that we can choose to be authentic, that is, to try to understand what our existence and our world can manifest, and commit to it. We can make a decision about our future rather than follow supposedly existing order, whether it is natural, supernatural, or political. In fact, we don't have to appeal to an order, perfection, in the first place in order to be free, because we are always already free, that is, undetermined. But we must make this freedom our own in order to have agency by questioning our being. Because Dasein is always already open to the truth, it can question the meaning of entities in the world rather than accepting them as others. Heidegger then shows how human agency is possible, which is also the possibility for civil disobedience. Because time or being is finite, human beings can constantly respond to the truth, rather than being determined by it as modern rationalists hold. This means that the authority of objectivity over subjectivity is broken, since the self and the world are interdependent. When I lose the world, I am losing myself, and vice versa. Kant and Hegel loosen the authority of nature and God over man with their critical philosophy, and Heidegger broke it completely apart. Human beings curate their being through finite time, rather than being in time and space. And as such, they cannot be determined by God, nature, reason, or universal history in the first place. Dasein doesn't try to save its soul and do what it's supposed to do, now and at all times, as it was prescribed to it by the moral law, or the Cartesian method that arrives from nowhere. But it tries to listen to the voice of conscience. By facing its death, its necessary future, it can choose to be authentic, that is, to respond to its being, and in effect, to decide to live in a truer world in its possible future. Dasein, then, doesn't sacrifice its life to what it already believes in order to transcend nature, like the Socratic hero and Malick's character in A Hidden Life does, but takes its death, its fate, its nature as an opportunity to open its future to meaning. Heidegger's point as an existentialist is that we always have to understand the meaning of our lives and our world in the situation we found ourselves in, rather than constantly trying to keep our conscience clean and act and think formally. In our modern formal way of life, we forgot to respond to our being, and instead got used to following our laws, rules, customs, and identities in order to avoid being anxious out of fear of punishment or being incorrect, or the desire to have comfort and peace of mind. We ignore their meaning to our being in the world, their potential, that which made it possible for us to objectify them in the first place. This is why we have to be anxious about their truth and understand their meaning once again, to be reminded why they are significant to us. We constantly have to rediscover the potential of our being in the world, rather than relying on given answers. The hero in A Hidden Life didn't know whether he should act against his convictions, but he was never anxious about them. Since he took his truths as absolute, he was willing to sacrifice his life for them, to be a martyr, rather than open his being and act in their name. But according to his critics, this is exactly the problem with Heidegger's philosophy, meaning that it doesn't have any moral or epistemic foundation which can protect us from making errors, from failing, and being immoral. Instead of being dedicated to the truth, understood as what is metaphysically correct and morally right, in order to find ourselves in the world, Heidegger's philosophy is dedicated to fundamental ontology, that is, to try to understand how any being can come into being in the first place, in order to rediscover ourselves in our world. And since his answer to this question again is finite time, the possible, everything is possible for him, which can explain his political commitment. But Heidegger's Aristotelian point is that anything comes into being because it presents us with a potential. That is, it could manifest something in the future for us, and not because of the actual, the rational, that which causes anything that we observe now to be the way it is. And any existential potentiality is not arbitrary, but has historical context to different agents in different social environments. This means that human existence cannot be the means to an end, the means to rational, moral, historical, or political orders, since it already affords them certain possibilities, which they constantly have to be confronted with. The way we understand ourselves and the world is dependent on different impersonal, existing understandings, which means, again, that in order to be authentic, we have to question them and make them truthful, significant for us, to fulfill the possibility of time, of being, and overcoming our neuroses. But since modern life is governed by orders, and any kind of order suppresses the traditional and the creative, it is harder for us to fulfill our own most potentiality. This is why we have to resist our desire to understand everything we face as a determined object and be fated, and instead try to understand its potential in order to become faithful. And if we do, it can even help us to overcome our nihilistic tendencies that are being normalized today.
I spent 30 years not living life, but ruining it for myself and others. I can't remember a man I wanted to be.
Contemporary metaphysical realists that rely mostly on the findings of neuroscience studies, like, for example, Sam Harris and Yuval Noah Harari, are proud nihilists. Because they rationalize the world by looking at the brain, everything they experience, including their own existence, loses its meaning and becomes a lie, a copy, or a byproduct of something more real, rational, infinite. For these thinkers, we are determined by our physical and biological conditions, which mean that if we want to live in peace, we should listen to what our new God, the brain, tells us about ourselves, rather than discover our world in its meaningfulness and be free from any authority. But if history taught us anything, it is that when human beings are reduced to a machine that doesn't need them in order to function, it will eventually destroy them, or the humans will destroy it first, in order to set themselves free from it. Modern rationalists such as Descartes also believe, like scientific realists, that being can be mathematized, but unlike them, they don't deny the existence of consciousness. In fact, they begin their inquiry with the being of the I think, because they can be certain in its completeness, its identity. According to them, because their mind is mechanical, mathematical, they can mathematize being. This solves the problem their finite point of view on reality challenged them with, on their quest to know the absolute meaning of being. But because they began this quest with self-assertion, they can't really get out of their heads, which means that the only way that they can get access to being is by destroying their identity. Rationalism, which either involves reduction or self-reduction, always leads to destruction and self-destruction. Heidegger then perhaps was right when he argued that metaphysical pursuits are responsible for the horrors of the 20th century, since it makes us narcissistic and nihilistic, rather than the loss of conscience, of moral values, and the truth with a capital T, that is, classic nihilism, as Malick's film, A Hidden Life, seemed to suggest.
Christ's life is a demand. We don't want to be reminded of it. So we don't have to see what happens to the truth. Darker time is coming.
By holding on to the lawful, to our image, we lose our sense of self, we become alienated, and as a result, we develop dependency on the outside world. But the world that we are supposed to be dependent on is empty as well. It is a world that is governed only by production and consumption. We become empty and the world becomes empty, which drives us to destruction and self-destruction. When the natural and the cultural world are seen as perfect engines, Human beings either become obedient to their unquestioned laws because it frees them from needing to choose for themselves and from being anxious, or they begin to resent any law that curtails their freedom to believe in whatever they want to and do whatever they need to in order to gain more power, as fascist leaders do. They become the slaves of the rational, to that which has an identity, or replace it out of defiance with their own order, with their own identity, and destroy those who they cannot reduce to it. Heidegger clearly understood this point, but nevertheless, he was convinced that the fascist leader and his party would end metaphysical pursuits in favor of openness to being. This is baffling and disturbing in light of what they did in Germany after 1933, that is, after he joined them. But it does not justify certain philosophical circles, such as the critical theory circle, from discrediting him for his political affiliation. After all, they were influenced by his warnings against rationalism, against technology, against any reduction of human beings to political and social orders, such as capitalism and communism. Any attempt to control the world gets out of control. And they used in their theories his descriptions of our tendencies to lose ourselves, to lose our agency, to get distracted, curious, and chatty, to live in the simulacra which rationality creates, rather than face our death, discover what is significant for us, and fulfill the potential of our being in the world. Metaphysics, the reduction of being to one identity, is a quest for authority, that is, to be limited by God, the forms, innate ideas, reason, forms of cognition, universal history, evolutionary biology, or mechanical physics, in the hope to be free from the lies of existence and become who we are supposed to be, naturally or normally, in a determined or self-determined world. For Heidegger, on the other hand, the meaning of being is an open question, since being can't be exhausted, determined, perfect, complete. That is, it cannot be identified. The meaning of being cannot be reduced to physics, biology, psychology, or logic, because it affords us to discover any meaning in the first place. Being makes it possible for the truth to show up, and as such, it cannot be totalized. So the human quest to know the absolute in order to be free is self-defeating and self-destructive. Instead, we should be on a quest for the discovery of more meanings. We should keep trying to answer who we are and what our world could be in order to have a more meaningful existence. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. And if you like our videos, please support us via our PayPal link.